this might, I think it's the wearable one that's causing the problems. This is the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Glory to you, O Lord. Now when Jesus heard about the beheading of John the Baptist, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. So our little family of 3, we have some specific dietary needs. And if any of you live with food allergies or special dietary requirements like we do, you know what I mean when I say that it can be hard to eat with other people. It takes some careful planning, sometimes you've got to eat ahead of time. And if you've ever been on the other side, and I know some of you have been, preparing a meal for many people, you know how complicated it can get to make sure everyone can enjoy food together. My dad and I, for example, have nearly opposite diets. We can eat very few things in common, so it really can feel like a modern-day miracle when we find a holiday meal option that can feed us both. I've been thinking about this because this summer I have been sharing a lot of meals with a group. Every Monday I eat with those Synod interns that I was mentioning in the announcements. This group of young adults, we have lunch together every Monday. And we've found that the best strategy is just to have everyone fill out a specific sheet of paper for their lunch order to make sure all their requirements are met. Last week, one intern, she just handed me her lunch order, and it had all of these specifics written on it for a sandwich, right? Just all these adjustments to a sandwich to meet her dietary needs. And she kind of apologized and she said, "Oh, I'm a really picky eater." And when she heard that I too had some restrictions that I had been living with for years, she said, "Oh, you must have all the hacks, right? You have all the best tricks." And I told her, "Here is my best hack. Bring your own food." Sometimes it's just easier that way. You can't always count on being able to eat when you go somewhere. So bring your own food. Well, the crowd who had gathered to hear Jesus teach on the shores of Galilee, they could really have used this hack. None of them had brought their own food. And now it was getting close to dinner time, and they found themselves far from the nearest restaurant with nothing to eat. Rookies. Actually, they're so naive, they don't even seem to notice that it's getting so late and no one is catering this event.
I can't do anything about it.
His disciples have to pull him aside and they tell him, "Jesus, send these people home ASAP so that they can get back to town before all the food courts close." But Jesus disagrees. "We don't have to send them away," he says. "They can just stay and eat here." And we all know the rest of the story. No caterer, no problem. They gather what little food they do have on hand, and Jesus makes it enough. Jesus always makes it enough. Thousands of people, this is quite a crowd, are able to eat their fill with leftovers besides. I find it a challenge to feed 50 people, and here Jesus is effortlessly feeding 5,000 men plus their families. feeding them. I think there's another layer of hospitality going on here. Jesus makes it possible for these people to stay. They have come to this deserted place to see Jesus, after all. They have come because they've heard that Jesus can heal ills. They've come because they've heard that Jesus' teachings are life-giving. They've come to find wisdom and guidance. They've come to find connection and community. By feeding them, Jesus doesn't just make it possible for them to eat, but for them to stay and get all those other forms of nourishment they came for too. I think this is a model for us as the church. We do spend a lot of time feeding people. Think about how many ministries in this congregation alone have to do with food. Our farmers market draws people together around food. We participate in Minnesota Food Share Month when we raise money and food for people who are food insecure. The Loaves and Fishes community meal, the Bun Run collection of baked goods to distribute. So many ministries involve food. Now, if you visit any one of these ministries, you will see this feeding miracle we heard in Matthew coming to life again, even in our day. Has anyone experienced this? When you bring what you have, somehow there is more. Somehow God makes more. God provides through what we offer. Eating together is also a central image in our weekly gathering, right? Our worship. We gather around the table. We share bread and wine, and there is always enough and more besides. Maybe if we really wanted to tie in the symbolism of this feeding miracle from the Gospels, we should serve some dried fish along with our bread. What do you think? Maybe we'll stick to wine. But really, it is hard to hear this gospel story about Jesus' miracle of abundance and not think about communion. I mean, the text even says that Jesus took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and shared it. Does that sound familiar? But just as Jesus' miracle of feeding the 5,000 is about more than just food, so should our ministry and worship be as well. Remember that in offering this meal, Jesus invited all those people to stay. He allowed them to stay and ask questions that they had about his message. He allowed them to stay and meet other people committed to learning the way of the gospel. He allowed them to stay and keep learning, keep connecting, keep growing in faith. They need not go away, Jesus had told the disciples. Let's make it so they can stay. Our ministry programs can do that too. Even when we're offering people food, we're offering more than food. People might also come to find community and acceptance and rest and hope and friendship. I've been hearing these news stories recently about how great the need is for food programs. This is just one example, but in 2022, food shelves in Minnesota saw a nearly 54% increase from the previous year, visits to food shelves. That's amazing. But I can also tell you that the need for these other forms of nourishment, connection, and acceptance and friendship, these are also incredibly high. People need relationship and meaning and belonging and community. And for many reasons, these things feel harder to find lately. This is one reason why I think it's important to offer communion as often as we can, because you never know who is showing up hungry. And I don't mean literally physically hungry. I mean, you never know who is desperate for the spiritual nourishment they might find around this table, the nourishment they might find after worship in fellowship, in learning together. Did you know Martin Luther called the church a hospital for sinners? You don't have to come here righteous and perfect. Actually, if you're feeling righteous and perfect, church probably isn't the place for you. Church is the place you can come when you're desperate or weary or sick or hopeless or fed up or heartbroken or guilt-ridden or hurting. Luther even described communion, the sacrament of communion, as a stretcher because it can carry us to God who will revive us. Listen, bring your own food
is a great hack for road trips when you might not find an accommodating restaurant for miles. But it is not a hack you need to come to church. You don't need to bring your own food here. I mean, of course, you don't have to bring literal food unless you're hosting coffee hour, but I also mean you can come spiritually hungry. You can come just as you are, no preparation or planning required. You can come as you are and let God meet you and feed you at this table. Catherine of Siena was a medieval mystic and writer who loved the imagery of communion and the way that it opened us up to the breadth of God's provision. And she liked to say that God is for us table, food, and waiter. You're probably most familiar with that middle one, right? The idea that God is food. We certainly proclaim that over and over in communion, that the bread and wine at this table is the body and blood of Christ, that Christ is present among us. But Catherine, being a mystic, used her imagination to expand that imagery even further. What if God is also the table upon which the food is served? God provides the very venue for us to come together and eat. God gathers us into community so that we might not eat alone. And not only is God like the spiritual food we eat and the communal table we gather around, but God is like the waiter who serves us, Catherine said. God makes sure we have what we need, brings more when we need it. God makes sure we can stay and find all the forms of nourishment we need. You know, when I hear this gospel story about feeding the 5,000, I always think about those leftovers at the end. Did you notice that after all had been fed, there were 12 baskets left over? That is more than the food they started with. They started with 5 loaves and 2 fish and finished with 12 baskets full of extra. In God's economy, any investment will grow and increase into blessing for more and more people. Anything we offer will be used to serve others and build the kingdom. So I wonder what happened to those leftovers. And I wonder if they weren't sent home with some of the crowd who had gathered so that they might extend the miracle even further. They might offer nourishment to even more people. Anyone in need they met along the way back home. They could offer them not only literal physical food, but the nourishment of connection and friendship as well. We can do the same as we go out from here. We are fed around the communion table in worship and around the fellowship tables during coffee hour, and we are sent into the world to offer God's provision to any we meet who need it. It turns out that God's grace does not run out the more we share it. Instead, it increases the more it is shared. There is always enough in God and more besides. Thanks be to God. Amen.